Laos is often called one of Southeast Asia's hidden countries, a landlocked nation surrounded by giants like Thailand, Vietnam, and China. Today, it is known for its natural beauty, Buddhist temples, and laid-back culture. But the story of modern Laos cannot be told without looking at the time when it became part of the French colonial empire. This was a period that transformed the country's politics, economy, and society, and it set the stage for the struggles Laos would face during the 20th century. To understand French Laos, we need to go back to the 19th century. At that time, the region we now call Laos was divided into several small kingdoms and principalities. The most important of these was Luang Prabang in the north. But the area was not united as a single country. Instead, it was often caught between larger powers, Thailand to the west and Vietnam to the east. Thailand, then known as Siam, had considerable influence over these Lao territories. Many Lao rulers paid tribute to Bangkok, while parts of the land were also under Vietnamese influence. This meant that the Lao people were often ruled from outside, rather than forming a strong central state of their own. Meanwhile, France had begun expanding its empire in Asia. After taking control of parts of southern Vietnam in the 1860s, the French gradually moved into Cambodia and then northern Vietnam. Their long-term goal was to dominate the Mekong River, which they hoped would become a trade route into China. In the 1880s, French explorers and officials became increasingly interested in the Lao territories, seeing them as strategically important. After a series of conflicts with Siam, France forced Siam to cede lands east of the Mekong River. This included much of what is now Laos. In 1893, this new territory was officially placed under French protection, and Laos became part of French Indochina. At first, it was not a colony in its own right, but was administratively tied to Vietnam. The French did not see Laos as particularly rich or profitable, but they believed it was important for controlling the region. From the very beginning, French rule in Laos was quite different from its rule in Vietnam. Vietnam was considered the core of French Indochina, with major ports, cities, and a large population. By contrast, Laos was sparsely populated, landlocked, and difficult to develop. The French often referred to it as a backwater colony. Because of this, investment was limited. Roads and railways were few, and the economy remained underdeveloped compared to Vietnam or Cambodia. The French administration in Laos was small and weak, relying heavily on local rulers to maintain order. Still, French influence was felt in important ways. One of the most visible changes was in the capital. In 1899, Vientiane was chosen as the administrative center. Under French guidance, it was rebuilt with new roads, government buildings, and schools. Even today, parts of Vientiane still show the architectural influence of that era. Another key area was education. The French introduced a limited school system, teaching both the Lao language and French. But access was extremely restricted, mostly limited to the children of the elite. For most Lao people, traditional Buddhist temples remained the main centers of learning. The French also worked to preserve and promote certain aspects of Lao culture. Unlike in Vietnam, where the colonial authorities tried to impose stronger control, in Laos they often emphasized the idea of a distinct Lao identity. This was partly to keep Laos separate from Siam and to justify their own rule. At the same time, the Lao population had little say in governance. The real power lay with French officials, and many important decisions were made in Hanoi or Paris rather than in Vientiane or Luang Prabang. Economically, Laos remained underdeveloped throughout the colonial period. The French encouraged the production of coffee in the Balavan Plateau, a highland region in the south. This became one of the few successful export crops and remains important today. But overall, Laos did not become a major source of wealth for France. Life for ordinary Lao people changed slowly. Many continued farming in traditional ways, living in rural villages with little contact with the colonial administration. For them, French rule often felt distant, though taxes and occasional demands for labor were reminders of the new authorities. Over time, however, global events began to reshape French Laos. During World War II, the situation became unstable. In 1940, France itself was defeated by Germany, and French Indochina came under the control of the Vichy regime, which collaborated with the Axis powers. Japan, which was expanding rapidly in Asia, soon occupied much of Indochina. Although Japanese control in Laos was less direct than in Vietnam, it still weakened French authority. In March 1945, Japan formally overthrew French rule in the region and encouraged local leaders to declare independence. In Luang Prabang, King Sisavangvong declared that Laos would be independent under Japanese guidance. But Japan surrendered just a few months later, in August 1945, and the French moved quickly to reassert control. By early 1946, French troops had returned, and Laos was brought back into French Indochina. This return, however, was not as secure as before. The end of World War II had inspired independence movements all across Asia. In Vietnam, the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh had already declared independence, beginning what would become the First Indochina War. In Laos, nationalist movements also began to emerge. One of the most important was the Lao Isara, or Free Laos movement. Formed in 1945, it opposed the return of French rule and sought full independence. While it was not as strong or organized as movements in Vietnam, it showed that a new spirit of nationalism was taking shape. The French responded by granting Laos a new status. In 1949, Laos became an associated state within the French Union with greater autonomy, but still linked to France. This was meant to satisfy nationalist demands while maintaining French influence. In 1953, as the situation in Vietnam grew more difficult, France finally granted full independence to Laos. The Franco-Lao Treaty of Friendship and Association recognized Laos as a sovereign nation, though France continued to provide economic and military assistance. The independence of Laos was not the end of its struggles. In fact, it marked the beginning of a turbulent period during the Cold War, when Laos would become caught between global powers once again. But the French colonial era left lasting marks. It had introduced new administrative structures, connected Laos more firmly to the idea of being a single nation, and shaped its capital city and education system. Yet, it had also left the country underdeveloped and vulnerable, with weak infrastructure and limited experience in self-government. Looking back, French Laos was a time of both change and continuity. For decades, much of daily life in rural villages remained the same as it had for centuries. But the borders, institutions, and international relationships forged during that period still influence the country today. When we talk about Laos as part of modern Southeast Asia, its colonial past is impossible to ignore. The era of French Laos, from colonization in the late 19th century to independence in the mid-20th century, tells us how a small, landlocked country became part of global struggles and how it eventually emerged as a nation of its own. Thanks for watching. Have you ever visited Laos?